Sarah Mitchell thought she had lived a pretty ordinary life. At 28, she worked as a marketing coordinator in downtown Chicago, lived in a cozy apartment with her tabby cat named Whiskers, and spent most weekends visiting her parents in the suburbs. Her biggest worry was whether she'd get that promotion at work, and her most exciting Friday night involved ordering takeout and binge-watching true crime documentaries. She had no idea that everything she believed about her family was about to be turned completely upside down. It all started on a rainy Thursday morning in October. Sarah was rushing to catch the train when her phone buzzed with a call from her mother. Linda Mitchell rarely called during work hours, so Sarah immediately felt that familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. Her mother's voice sounded strange, shaky in a way Sarah had never heard before. Linda explained that she had been cleaning out the attic and found an old shoebox hidden behind some Christmas decorations. Inside were documents and photographs that didn't make sense. There was a birth certificate with Sarah's name on it, but the parents listed weren't Linda and Robert Mitchell. Instead, it showed completely different names, Elena Vasquez and Michael Torres. There were also letters written in Spanish, baby photos of a child who looked exactly like Sarah, and a small gold necklace with the initials Evie engraved on it. Sarah felt the world spinning around her as she tried to process this information. She had always been told she was adopted, but her parents had explained that her birth parents had died in a car accident when she was just 6 months old. They said they had adopted her through a reputable agency in Illinois, and that all the records were sealed. Sarah had never questioned this story because she had always felt loved and wanted by the Mitchells. The documents in the shoebox told a completely different story. According to the birth certificate, Sarah had been born in San Antonio, Texas, not Chicago. The letters, which Linda had managed to translate using an online service, were from Elena Vasquez to someone named Maria, describing her desperate situation. Elena had been a teenage mother, working multiple jobs to support herself and her baby daughter. The letters revealed that Elena had never wanted to give up her child, but circumstances had forced her into an impossible situation. Sarah took the next day off work and drove to her parents' house. When she arrived, she found Linda and Robert sitting at the kitchen table, looking older and more fragile than she had ever seen them. The shoebox sat between them like a ticking time bomb. Sarah carefully examined each document, each photograph, each letter. The resemblance between herself and the young woman in the photos was undeniable. Elena Vasquez had the same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting her head when she smiled. Robert finally broke the silence. His voice was barely above a whisper as he began to explain the truth. He and Linda had been trying to have children for years, going through multiple rounds of fertility treatment with no success. They had been approved for adoption through legitimate channels, but the waiting list was years long. They were desperate and heartbroken when a colleague of Robert's mentioned knowing someone who could help them get a baby more quickly. The arrangements had been made through a network of people who operated in the shadows of the legal adoption system. They had paid $15,000 in cash and had been told that the birth mother was a drug addict who had died shortly after giving birth. They were given fabricated documents and told to never speak of how they had really obtained their daughter. Robert and Linda had been so desperate for a child that they had convinced themselves they were doing the right thing, that they were giving a baby a better life. Sarah spent the next few weeks in a state of shock. She couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The life she had always known felt like a lie. She had been stolen from her birth mother, and her adoptive parents had been complicit in this theft. The worst part was that Elena Vasquez might still be alive, somewhere in Texas, wondering what had happened to her baby daughter. Sarah decided she had to find the truth. She took a leave of absence from work and began investigating. She started by contacting the Vital Records office in San Antonio, but hit dead ends immediately. The birth certificate in the shoebox appeared to be genuine, but there were no corresponding records in the official system. It was as if Elena Vasquez had never existed. Sarah then tried searching social media and online databases, but Elena Vasquez was too common a name to yield useful results. She hired a private investigator who specialized in reunion cases, but even he struggled to find any trace of Elena. It was as if she had vanished completely after giving birth. After months of searching, Sarah finally got a break. The private investigator had been working with a contact in the San Antonio Police Department who remembered a case from the late 1990s. A young woman named Elena Vasquez had filed a missing person report for her infant daughter, claiming that the baby had been taken from her hospital room. The police had investigated but had found no evidence of foul play. Elena had been labeled as an unstable young mother, possibly suffering from postpartum depression, and the case had been quietly closed. The police contact was able to provide an address where Elena had been living at the time. Sarah immediately booked a flight to San Antonio. Her heart was pounding as the plane descended into the Texas heat. She had no idea what she would find, or if Elena would even be alive after all these years. The address led to a rundown apartment complex in a neighborhood that had clearly seen better days. Sarah knocked on the door of apartment 3B, the last known address for Elena Vasquez. An elderly Hispanic woman answered, looking suspicious and tired. Sarah tried to explain who she was looking for, but the woman just shook her head and said that Elena had moved away years ago. Sarah was about to give up when the woman mentioned that Elena had worked at a local diner called Rosa's Kitchen. Sarah spent the rest of the day driving around San Antonio, looking for this diner. She finally found it tucked away in a strip mall, a small family-owned restaurant that looked like it had been there for decades. When Sarah walked into Rosa's Kitchen, she immediately felt a strange sense of familiarity. The smell of cumin and fresh tortillas filled the air, and she realized that these were scents that had always comforted her, though she had never understood why. She approached the counter and asked about Elena Vasquez. The woman behind the counter, who introduced herself as Rosa, immediately became emotional. She explained that Elena had worked at the restaurant for several years in the early 2000s, but had left town abruptly after her son was born. Rosa had always wondered what had happened to Elena, as she had been like a daughter to her. Rosa provided Sarah with a crucial piece of information. Elena had remarried and taken her husband's name. She was now Elena Rodriguez, and she had moved to Houston with her new family. Rosa even had an old address, though she warned Sarah that it was probably outdated. Sarah drove to Houston that same day. The address Rosa had given her led to a modest suburban house with a well-maintained garden and children's toys scattered across the front yard. Sarah sat in her rental car for nearly an hour, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. What would she say? How do you tell someone that you might be their daughter who was stolen 30 years ago? Finally, Sarah walked up to the front door and rang the bell. A woman in her late 40s answered, and Sarah immediately knew she had found her birth mother. Elena Rodriguez had aged, but she still had the same eyes, the same facial structure that Sarah saw in the mirror every day. Elena looked at Sarah with confusion, then with growing recognition, then with complete shock. Elena's hand flew to her mouth as she stared at Sarah. Without saying a word, she seemed to understand exactly who was standing on her doorstep. Tears began streaming down her face as she whispered Sarah's name, the name she had given her daughter all those years ago. Sophia. Elena invited Sarah inside, and they sat in the living room surrounded by photos of Elena's current family. Elena had 2 teenage sons with her husband Carlos, and looking at the family photos, Sarah could see the resemblance between herself and her half-brothers. Elena's hands shook as she began to tell her story. Elena had been 17 when Sarah was born. She had been working 2 jobs to support herself and her baby, living in a tiny apartment and struggling to make ends meet. The father of her child had disappeared when she told him she was pregnant, and Elena's own family had disowned her for having a baby out of wedlock. When Sarah was 3 months old, Elena had been admitted to the hospital with severe pneumonia. She had been unconscious for several days, and when she woke up, she was told that her baby had been placed in emergency foster care. When she was discharged from the hospital, Elena had gone to the Child Services office to get her daughter back, only to be told that there was no record of her baby. Elena had spent years searching for her daughter. She had filed police reports, hired lawyers she couldn't afford, and contacted every agency she could think of. Everyone told her the same thing. There was no record of her baby, and perhaps she had been confused or delusional due to her illness. Elena had been gaslit and dismissed at every turn. Eventually, Elena had been forced to accept that her daughter was gone forever. She had suffered a complete breakdown and had spent several years in and out of therapy. It was only when she met Carlos and started a new family that she had been able to find some peace, though she had never stopped wondering about her first daughter. As Elena told her story, Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. She was devastated to learn about her birth mother's suffering, but also angry at the injustice of it all. Elena had been a victim of a system that had failed to protect her and her child. Sarah had been raised by loving parents, but that didn't change the fact that she had been stolen from her birth mother. Elena showed Sarah photos of herself as a baby, and Sarah was amazed to see how much she had looked like her half-brothers at the same age. Elena had kept a small shrine in her bedroom with Sarah's baby photos and the few mementos she had been able to save. She had never given up hope that someday her daughter would find her. Sarah spent the next week in Houston, getting to know Elena and her family. Carlos and the boys welcomed her with open arms, excited to meet the sister they had never known existed. Sarah was amazed to discover that she had inherited Elena's love of cooking, her ability to speak Spanish despite never having learned it formally, and her talent for dancing. But Sarah also struggled with feelings of guilt and confusion. She loved the Mitchells and didn't want to hurt them, but she also felt a deep connection to Elena that she had never experienced before. She felt like she was being torn between two families, two identities, two versions of herself. When Sarah returned to Chicago, she had to face the difficult conversation with Linda and Robert. They were terrified that they would lose their daughter, that she would choose her birth family over them. Sarah had to explain that family isn't just about blood or law, but about love and choice. She would always be their daughter, but she also needed to have a relationship with Elena. The healing process was slow and painful for everyone involved. Linda and Robert had to face the reality that their desperation had led them to participate in something that had caused tremendous pain to another family. They had to accept that their gain had been someone else's devastating loss. Elena had to process 30 years of grief and trauma, while also trying to build a relationship with the daughter she had never stopped loving. Sarah had to figure out how to integrate two very different families and cultures into her sense of self. Sarah also had to decide what to do about the illegal adoption. She consulted with lawyers and learned that the statute of limitations had long since passed, and that prosecuting the people involved would be nearly impossible. The adoption agency had closed decades ago, and most of the people involved were either dead or untraceable. In the end, Sarah chose to focus on healing and building relationships rather than seeking legal justice. She began splitting her time between Chicago and Houston, learning about her Mexican heritage and building relationships with her half-brothers. She also started therapy to help her process the complex emotions surrounding her identity and family relationships. Elena and Linda eventually met, and while their first encounter was awkward and painful, they both recognized that they shared something important. They both loved Sarah deeply. Over time, they developed a cautious friendship, bonded by their shared experience of motherhood and their mutual desire to see Sarah happy. Sarah's story became a catalyst for her to become involved in adoption reform advocacy. She began speaking at conferences and working with organizations that help families separated by illegal adoptions. She learned that her case was not unique, that there were thousands of families who had been torn apart by corrupt adoption practices. The experience also changed Sarah's perspective on family and identity. She realized that she was not just Sarah Mitchell or Sofia Vasquez, but a complex person shaped by both of her families and both of her cultures. She began incorporating elements of her Mexican heritage into her daily life, learning to cook traditional foods and celebrating holidays she had never known existed. Today, Sarah maintains close relationships with both families. She has two mothers who love her, two fathers who support her, and brothers who accept her completely. Her story is one of loss and trauma, but also of resilience, healing, and the power of love to overcome even the most difficult circumstances. Sarah's journey taught her that family is not just about genetics or legal documents, but about the people who choose to love and support each other through the most challenging times. She learned that healing is possible even from the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most beautiful relationships can grow from the most painful circumstances. The truth that had been hidden in a shoebox for 30 years had initially seemed like it would destroy everything Sarah thought she knew about herself. Instead, it had opened up a world of new relationships, new understanding, and new possibilities. Sarah had not lost a family when she discovered the truth. She had gained one.